Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan and this is the annotation of a game where I played the Rosentreter Gambit. So I'm playing white. e4, e5, knight f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4 and bishop to c5. So here we're seeing the giuoco piano, which is Italian for the quiet game, which may lead to a long game without many attacking possibilities. But I'm not in the mood for a quiet game, and at this point I'm playing d4, signaling the Rosentreter Gambit. And it looks like I'm just sacrificing a pawn, because I have two defenders on the pawn. Black has three attackers on the pawn. But as far as gambits go, I don't believe the Rosentreter Gambit is unsound at all. And I don't think there's a way for black to take advantage of the gambit and win the game with perfect play. But d4 is offered, and of course black must respond to the threat, because I'm attacking his bishop on c5. So the Rosentreter more or less forces the game into a specific direction. There are three ways for black to recapture the pawn. As said before, bishop, knight, or pawn. And white must be ready to face either one of those possibilities. Let's see what happens if black recaptures with the pawn. So it looks like black is up a pawn. There are now two defenders on the pawn and two attackers. So I must add a third attacker, which is pawn to c3. And it looks like I'm offering up a second pawn, but it isn't necessarily so. Let's see first if a random move is played, let's say h6. Then I can simply recapture the pawn, attack the bishop, and we can see white has a strong pawn island in the center. Bishop will have to retreat, and white has recaptured his pawn with a better position. So after c3, the most logical continuation for black is to recapture the second pawn. Pawn takes pawn, and now white can play bishop takes pawn on f7 check. Black recaptures, queen d5 check, looking to recapture the lost piece immediately. If king to e7, we can see that the king has moved on the same diagonal as the bishop. Queen takes bishop check, d6 blocks the check, and the queen can recapture the pawn. So the material is equal once again, but white now has the edge because black has lost castling privileges. If after queen d5 check, the king doesn't move onto the black squares, but instead moves to one of the white squares, let's say king to e8, white can play the in-between move, queen to h5 check, forcing black onto the black squares. So if black does, again, queen takes bishop check, black blocks the check, and I can regain the pawn before it does more damage. So that will end up the same. However, now black has the possibility to play g6 to block the check. So if I capture the bishop at this point, I don't get tempo with the check on black's king. Black can grab a second pawn, but after bishop recaptures, white has a huge positional compensation with immediate attack on the rook on h8, which more than compensates the lost pawn. So probably the knight will block and white can continue development and pressure the knight on f6. Notice that the king is also in the open. This is a winning position for white. So if we go back, pawn takes pawn leads to complications for black. What else can black try? He can play knight takes pawn on d4, after which white should play b4, pressuring the bishop that is defending the knight on c5. Of course, the bishop cannot recapture the pawn. If bishop takes pawn check, white can simply fork both pieces. So the idea is to move the bishop off of the defense of the knight on d4. Let's see what black can do. He can try bishop to b6, still protecting the knight on d4. Then we can continue to pressure the bishop with a4, looking for a5, which will trap the bishop. If a6 is played, to provide escape for the bishop, still protecting the knight on d4, I can play knight takes pawn. So I recapture the pawn on e5, and immediately I'll have an attack on f7. If alternatively knight takes knight and in between move, I can recapture with the queen, and black has the same problem. I have created an attack on f7. But now if black tries to stop the attack with, say, knight to f6, we can see that after a5, black's bishop is lost. Only square available is d4, and after c3 there is no longer any escape for the bishop. So after b4, black doesn't have to retreat the bishop to b6. He can try bishop to d6 instead. But now we can see that the knight is underprotected. Knight takes knight, pawn takes. Now we're noticing that although it's white's move, black is threatening bishop takes pawn on b4, gaining tempo with a check. And we cannot block the check with a pawn, because black is covering the c3 square. So although it's possible to recapture the pawn right away, white should consider his king safety first and castle. There are plenty of ways left to attack the pawn on d4, and at this point black cannot recapture the pawn on b4, because if he does and gets greedy and tries to win another pawn, white can now play queen to d4, threatening the pawn on g7 and rook on h8, and we can see already a discovered attack coming up on the bishop. So if f6 to block, then bishop can take on the knight, and if rook recaptures, I get a free minor piece. So that defense doesn't work. If instead knight to f6, I can play bishop takes pawn check to regain the pawn. Black recaptures the bishop, and then queen takes bishop on b4, protecting the pawn. Then white will have regained his pawn and is better because he has castles, whereas black's king is in the open. So that's a simple continuation that's winning for white. Better and more complex is to play e5 first, attacking the knight. Now there are two possibilities for black. He can either move the knight to h5 or retreat the knight to g8. all other squares are covered. If knight to h5, g4 will attack the knight immediately. And now it looks like black's knight has become trapped. Black can try complex defenses with queen to h4, which will, if nothing else, regain the pawn and create a pin on the queen on d4. But now if white plays bishop to e2, he can already protect the pawn after pawn takes knight, and again has created an attack on the bishop on b4. And there's not much black can do against it, because his knight is still trapped and can't move anywhere to safety. So if black retreats his bishop to safety, then perhaps queen to c3, getting off of the discovered attack, and meanwhile attacking a pawn on c7. If c6, pawn takes knight, which is still protected. Black has lost a minor piece. Instead, if not knight to h5, but if the knight retreats because of the threat of the pawn, knight to g8, white can continue with bishop takes pawn, check, king recaptures, and now queen takes bishop. And this variation is even stronger for white, because the queen can immediately fall back to f4 with check, and the pawn is covering the f6 square, so black doesn't have the possibility to bring the knight or the queen to defend. And the queen and pawn are a very strong attacking combination. Of course, the bishop can move in as well if needed, and the rook. So black is pretty much lost in this position. So again, this leads to complications for black. Now there's another possibility. If not pawn recaptures, and if not knight recaptures, black can try to recapture or to capture the pawn with his bishop. This is the move that was played in the game. Bishop takes pawn. So black willingly sacrifices the bishop pair, hoping to end up with a knight outpost on d4. So this has to be dealt with in another way. First, knight takes bishop, knight recaptures, so we're seeing a protected outpost on d4. And I play bishop to e3, adding a second attacker, which will exchange material and regain my lost pawn. Now black cannot keep his outpost, so let's say if a random move is played, say a6, I can take the knight, black recaptures, and I can recapture with the queen. And we can see that I'm having an immediate attack on g7 and perhaps h8. Also, I have 3 pieces developed, whereas black has nothing developed at all, and material is equal. So this would be better for white. If not a random move like a6 is played, but black tries to reinforce the outpost with, say, c5, we can simply kick the knight with c3. Now the knight has to move. Let's say knight to e6, protecting c5, that is now under attack of the bishop. I can capture the knight, black recaptures, and with the in-between queen takes queen check and king recaptures, I can now regain my lost pawn with bishop takes pawn. And we can see that black has doubled pawns and has lost castling privileges. Again, white is stronger. So keeping the knight outpost is a bad idea for black, black instead plays knight to e6. And this may be a mistake because knight to c6 looks stronger, but knight to e6 is played instead, allowing me the opportunity to sacrifice my bishop on e6 for the knight, which will end up with double pawns for black, but white in turn will have lost the bishop pair. So I'm sacrificing my bishop pair to double the pawns. Now I can trade off queens, but this leads more or less to an equal game, with too few pieces left to take advantage of the uncastled king. Instead, I'm immediately capitalizing on the unprotected pawns of black's position. Queen to h5, attacking the pawn on e5. Black plays queen to d6. Queen to g4, attacking the pawn on g7. And black plays queen to b4 check. Now, black is following the same principle. His queen is now attacking the unprotected pawn on b2, and if I move my queen, he can attack the unprotected pawn on e4. Also, black has gained tempo with a check. So I play knight to d2 to block the check, sacrificing the b2 pawn. But capturing the pawn is a mistake. If queen takes pawn, attacking the rook, I can play rook to b1, saving the rook and gaining tempo on the queen. If black tries to grab a second pawn, I can continue with my attack and play queen to g7, attacking the trapped rook. So capturing the pawn on b2 is a mistake. Black first plays g6 to prevent my attack on g7. So now black is threatening to take the pawn on b2. So I castle and protect the pawn with the king. Queen a4, attacking the pawn on a2. And now probably the best move is to play king to b1, which will protect the a2 pawn. However, since I am having a slightly better position, I continue my attack and play f4 instead. And f4 is designed to open up the f-file. After pawn takes pawn, or pawn takes pawn, to attack the weak f7. So let's say if pawn takes pawn is played, I can recapture with the queen, and then the rook will go to f1 to create a battery. Notice that the rook on d1 is also on an open file. So if now, say c6, I can play a random move. I can play rook to f1 and continue with the battery. If instead queen takes pawn, I can capture the pawn on c7, queen a1 check, knight to b1, and black is in a horrible position with his queen locked out of the game. And rook to f1 is coming up, queen to d8, which is devastating and mate of course for black. So black doesn't recapture the pawn, e takes f, but instead plays queen takes pawn on a2, looking for an attack himself on my king. So I capture black's pawn on the e file, opening up the f file. Queen a1 check, I block with the knight. And now it's difficult for black to continue development because there are too many threats on his king. If say knight to e7, so if black tries to develop the knight, which looks like a natural move, e7 being more or less the only square available, because h6 is covered and f6 is covered, then we can see that the knight development is too slow. After queen to f4, white has too many threats on black's king, so I'm looking to perhaps bring the rook to the half-open file. If knight to c6 and black continues development, I can play rook to f1, or alternatively queen to f6, threatening the rook. And if black castles, bishop to h6 will end up in mate. So there are a lot of attacking ideas, and black must choose carefully on how to develop. And developing the knight will lead to mate, so that's no possibility. If instead black tries bishop to d7, a move which was played, I continue with strengthening the f file, rook to f1. Now the bishop move allows black to castle queenside. However, that's a dead trap, because if black castles queenside, which wasn't played, I can play rook takes pawn, and if bishop to b5, for instance, queen takes pawn check, so we can see that the bishop cannot move. This will lead to either king to b8 and mate, or bishop to d7, so the bishop is retreating. Then queen takes bishop check, rook recaptures, rook f8 check, rook blocks, rook to d8 is a nice mate. So moving the bishop doesn't work. If instead black tries to bring the queen back into the game, queen a6, leaving the bishop on d7, instead we can get bishop to g5, attacking the rook. And of course, if the rook moves, rook takes bishop and black's defense will fall apart. b6 to create an escape, check, rook recaptures, rook takes check, king to b7, and queen takes pawn, and the knight on g8 is lost as well, and there's no hope for black. So castling queenside is a mistake for black. It wasn't played. Black instead plays bishop to b5, developing the bishop with tempo. So I need to waste the move and play rook to f2. And now once again it's difficult for black to find a winning move. Now castling queenside is not even possible because of the check black has to go through. Black plays h6 instead. And now I play bishop to c5, and black is as good as lost. Now bishop to c4 was played, so black is looking for bishop to a2, which will lead to an attack on white's king, but I can just crash through with queen takes pawn. Now this is threatening queen takes f7 mate. Pawn recaptures, so I've lost the queen. And now rook to f8 is checkmate. Notice that if black didn't continue his attack and would have played b6 instead to attack the bishop, I still could have crashed through with queen takes pawn on g6. And if pawn recaptures the bishop, queen takes pawn on f7 is mate as well. So there was no saving this position. And black lost the game in the giuoco piano at move 19 because of the Rosentreter Gambit. So I hope you enjoyed watching this Gambit play. Please leave a comment on YouTube and have a great evening.